What if I told you there's this mysterious world deep beneath our feet, like a solid ball, about the size of the moon?
Yeah, and hotter than the surface of the sun.
Exactly. And we can't go there, obviously, but somehow we know quite a bit about it.
It's pretty amazing stuff.
Welcome, everyone, to The Deep Dive. We take complex info, pull out the key bits, and help you get up to speed fast.
And today, yeah, we are plunging right into the fiery heart of our planet, Earth's inner core.
You've given us a really fascinating set of sources on this hidden part of Earth.
For sure. And our mission here is to unpack, the whole scientific journey. How was it discovered? What are its, frankly, mind-boggling properties?
Right, its composition, its structure, which is more complex than you might think.
Oh, definitely. And even how it moves and how old it actually is, which is surprisingly still debated.
So get ready for some aha moments as we explore this world within a world.
It's quite the journey, isn't it? Into the unseen heart of the planet.
Yeah, our sources cover the history, the physical stuff, what it's made of, the layers, how it grows, how it moves.
And, this ongoing quest to figure out its age.
Which leads to the first big challenge, right? How do you study something you literally cannot touch?
Exactly. We don't have samples like we do for, say, the Earth's mantle. So how do scientists know so much about something thousands of kilometers down?
Yeah, that's the key question. And the answer is really, well, ingenious.
It all started back in 1936 with a Danish seismologist, Inge Lehmann, a real pioneer.
Right. She was looking really closely at seismograms. You know, those recordings of earthquakes.
Yeah, the Earth's heartbeat.
From quakes way down in New Zealand, picked up by sensitive instruments all around the world.
And what she noticed was, well, revolutionary for the time. Some seismic waves weren't just passing through the core as expected.
They were bouncing off something.
Precisely. Reflecting off a distinct, solid boundary deep inside the molten outer core. From that echo, basically, she inferred this inner core existed.
And her estimate for the size, 1,400 kilometers radius. That was incredibly close to today's value, 1230-21 kilometers.
Yeah, remarkably close. Like finding a hidden room just by listening for the echo.
Amazing. And that just opened the floodgates, didn't it?
Totally. Just 2 years later, 1938, you had Benno Gutenberg and Charles Richter digging into more data, refining the sizes.
And by 1940, the idea of a solid iron inner core was taking shape.
Yep. And then Francis Birch in 52 concluded it was probably crystalline iron.
And that boundary is the Lehman discontinuity now, right? Or sometimes Bullen, or Lehman-Bullen.
That's one. And any doubt about it being solid was pretty much settled by 1971.
Right, and that same year, didn't Jawanski and Gilbert confirm the outer core was liquid using Earth's vibrations?
Exactly. Using the Earth's normal modes, how the whole planet sort of rings after a big quake. The specific ringing depends on the internal structure.
Which brings us neatly to the real heroes here. Seismic waves. There are remote sensors, right?
Absolutely. Our eyes and ears for the deep Earth. You've got the two main types.
P waves, primary waves. They compress things like sound waves and can go through solids and liquids.
Correct. And then the S waves, secondary or shear waves, they shake side to side.
And crucially, they can't travel through liquids. Only solids. That's the key difference.
That distinction is fundamental, and scientists mostly look at deep quakes, like 30 kilometers down or more.
Why deep ones specifically?
Because the mantle is more uniform down there, so the wave paths are cleaner, less complicated getting to the core.
Ah, makes sense. So they track these waves bouncing off the core, going through it.
But the real smoking gun, the proof the inner core is solid, comes from these amazing waves called PKJKP waves.
Okay, break that down for us. PKJKP.
Right. So imagine a P wave diving deep. It hits the inner core boundary. Now, instead of just passing through as a P wave or reflecting, some of it converts into an S wave.
Okay.
It then travels through the inner core as an S wave. That's the J part. Then when it leaves the inner core, it converts back into a P wave to travel to the surface.
Wow. So the fact that an S wave, the J part, can travel through it at all
proves it must be solid, because S waves just die in liquids. It's incredibly clever seismic detective work.
It really is. It's like tapping something miles away to see if it's solid.
Exactly. And beyond seismology, there are other clues, of course.
Like the Earth's magnetic field.
Yep. Generated mostly in the liquid outer core, but definitely influenced by heat flow from the solid inner core.
And just the Earth's basic properties, right? Its mass, gravity, how it spins.
All affected by the density and size of these deep layers. And as we mentioned, those ringing frequencies after big quakes also depend on the inner core's properties.
It's amazing how much we can piece together from these indirect measurements. Okay, so we know how we know. Let's talk about what we know. What's it actually like down there, the physical properties?
Well, first off, size. It's a solid ball, radius about 1,230 kilometers, give or take.
Which is what, 20% of Earth's radius? About 70% of the moon's?
Roughly, yeah. Volume-wise, tiny fraction of the Earth, like less
Ah.
than 1%, but still massive, 7.6 billion cubic kilometers.
And shape-wise, you mentioned it's like a slightly squashed sphere, an oblate ellipsoid.
Yeah, but actually more perfectly spherical than the Earth's surface itself. The radius at the poles is only about 3 kilometers shorter than at the equator. Very subtle flattening.
Okay, now for the crazy numbers. Pressure.
Yeah, hold on your hat. Between 330 and 360 gigapascals.
Which is?
3.3 to 3.6 million times the atmospheric pressure at sea level. Unimaginable pressure.
And the temperature. You mentioned the sun.
Right around 5,400 to 5,700 Kelvin. That's about 5,100 to 5,400 Celsius, or 9,300 to 9,800 Fahrenheit. About as hot as the sun's surface.
So, hang on. How can iron be solid at sun surface temperatures? Shouldn't it be gas or plasma?
That's the million-dollar question, or maybe the 3.6 million atmosphere question.
Right.
It comes back to that immense pressure. Pressure raises the melting point of materials, sometimes dramatically. For iron, at those core pressures, its melting temperature is actually higher than the core's temperature.
So the pressure basically forces it to stay solid, even when it's incredibly hot.
Exactly. It follows an equation called the Simon-Glatzel equation. It's physics under extremes we just don't experience up here.
Okay, what about density? Is it uniform?
Pretty smooth gradient, about 13 kilograms per liter at the very center, dropping slightly to 12.8 at the edge of the inner core.
And then a sudden drop in the liquid outer core.
Yep, down to about 12.1. Just for context, the rock in Earth's crust is only around 3.4 kilojoule, so this stuff is dense.
Makes sense it accounts for, what, nearly 2% of Earth's mass despite its relatively small size?
About 1.7%, yeah. Mass is about 160th of the whole Earth.
And gravity down there. Less than here.
Yeah, significantly less. About 4.3 meters per second squared at the inner core surface, compared to our 9.8 meters per Hertz rate. You'd feel lighter if you weren't instantly crushed and vaporized.
Good point. Okay, let's skip the vacation plans. What about those seismic wave speeds again?
Right, so S waves, the shear waves, travel at about 3.7 kilometers in the center, slowing slightly to 3.5 at the edge.
Slower than in the mantle or crust.
Oh yeah, much slower. Deep mantle S waves are over 7 kilometers, and P waves are faster, around 11.4 kilometers at the center, down to 11.1 at the edge, then dropping to 10.4 in the liquid outer core.
Interesting. Now the magnetic field connection, you said the inner core isn't a magnet itself.
Correct. It's too hot for permanent magnetism. It's not ferromagnetic, but it plays a huge role.
How so?
Mostly through heat. The heat flowing out of the solidifying inner core helps drive the convection currents in the liquid outer core. And it's those currents of molten iron swirling around that generate Earth's magnetic field.
Ah, so the inner core is like the engine's heat source.
In a way, yes. And its presence also helps stabilize those currents. Bruce Buffett calculated back in 2010 that the field within the outer core is probably around 2.5 millitus.
Which is way stronger than at the surface.
About 40 times stronger than the maximum we measure up here. He figured that out by looking at tiny effects of the moon and sun's tides on the outer core liquid. Really clever stuff.
Wow. Okay, one last property. Viscosity. You said it acts solid to seismic waves.
Right, because seismic waves are fast vibrations. But over very long timescales could it flow? Scientists estimate its viscosity is maybe 10 to the power of 18 Pascal seconds.
Which means?
It means it's incredibly viscous. A sextillion times the viscosity of water. A billion times the viscosity of pitch. You know, that stuff that looks solid but flows over decades.
So practically solid, but maybe not perfectly rigid over geological time?
Exactly. It leaves the door open for the possibility of very slow convection currents within the inner core itself, which might explain some other weird things we see.
Okay, so we know how we found it. We know it's this incredibly extreme place.
Yeah.
But what's it actually made of?
Yeah.
And does it have its own internal structure?
Right, the composition. As we said, no direct samples, but based on what's abundant in the solar system and Earth's overall chemistry, the best guess is an iron-nickel alloy.
Mostly iron with some nickel thrown in.
Yep, but crucially, not pure iron-nickel. If it were, calculations show its density would be about 3% higher than what seismic data tells us.
Meaning there must be something lighter mixed in?
Exactly. Probably lighter elements like silicon, oxygen, maybe sulfur, maybe 2–3% of the mass is these lighter elements, plus up to maybe 10% nickel.
And you mentioned oxygen gets left behind in the outer core as the inner core freezes.
Yeah, that's a key part of the whole dynamo process. Iron crystallizes, pushing lighter elements like oxygen out into the liquid outer core, making it more buoyant and driving convection. The outer core might have 8-13% oxygen.
And the crystal structure down there, you mentioned hexagonal, close packed.
Yeah, Oi iron, epsilon iron. It's a structure that iron takes under extreme pressure. Think of it like stacking oranges really efficiently. It forms these hexagonal layers.
Okay, so you'd think maybe it's just a giant uniform crystal ball of this stuff down there.
That was the initial thought for many, yeah. Maybe even one single enormous crystal. But the data, well, the data says it's much more interesting, far from homogeneous.
How so?
This is where it gets really cool. Back in 1983, G. Poupinet noticed something odd about those PKIKP waves, the ones that go straight through the inner core.
What did he notice?
They traveled faster if they went along a path close to the Earth's rotation axis, basically. North-south compared to paths across the equator, east-west.
Faster. How much faster?
About 2 seconds faster over the whole trip through the core, which implies the P waves themselves move about 1% faster north-south through the inner core material. Later studies refined that to maybe 0.5% to 1.5%.
Whoa, so the inner core has a grain, like wood, a preferred direction.
Exactly. It's called anisotropy, axis-aligned anisotropy, because the fast direction aligns with Earth's rotation axis.
But why? Why would a solid ball of iron deep underground care about north-south versus east-west?
Great question. It likely comes down to those hexagonal crystals, the A iron. The crystals themselves are anisotropic. They let waves travel faster along one axis than others.
So if the crystals are somehow lined up,
Then the whole inner core would appear anisotropic to seismic waves. And there are a few ideas about why they might line up.
like what?
One idea is slow flow, or creep. Maybe the iron is slowly oozing like incredibly stiff glaciers, perhaps flowing from the equator where it might freeze slightly slower towards the poles. This flow could align the crystals.
Or maybe convection within the inner core, even if it's super viscous.
That's another possibility, especially maybe when the core was younger and hotter. Or it could be the growth process itself. Perhaps crystals tend to grow faster with their fast axis pointing radially outwards, aligning with the heat flow.
Could the magnetic field play a role?
Some have suggested that too, that the field could slowly deform the inner core over eons, causing alignment. It's still an active area of research.
But the story gets even more complex, right?
Yeah.
It's not just anisotropic. It might have layers within layers.
Just when you think you've got it figured out. In 2002, Ishii and Jaworski found evidence for an innermost inner core, an IMI.
A core within the core.
Kind of. A central region, maybe 300 to 750 kilometers in radius, that seems to have different anisotropic properties than the outer part of the inner core.
And then there was a 3-layer model proposed more recently.
Yeah, Wang and Song in 2018 suggested maybe an inner core, IAC, then an outer inner core, OIC, and then a thin isotropic layer on top.
And the weird part there was the alignment switching directions.
Exactly. In their model, the fast direction for P waves is parallel to the Earth's axis in the OIC, but perpendicular to the axis in the IAC. Again, this is debated. Some think it's more of a gradual change.
And the latest news from 2023, another layer.
Well, evidence for a distinct innermost ball about 650 kilometers thick. Its anisotropy is different again. Waves traveling at about 50 degrees from the rotation axis are significantly slower, like 4% slower.
A fossilized record of a significant global event. What could that mean?
That's the tantalizing part. Maybe some major change in how the core grew early on, or some past event that got locked into the structure. It hints at a really dynamic history.
It's like geological tree rings, but on a planetary scale.
Sort of, yeah. And it's not just layers. There might be east-west differences, too.
Lateral variations.
Tanaka and Hamaguchi suggested in '97 that the north-south anisotropy was stronger in the eastern hemisphere under Asia than the western hemisphere under the Americas.
Any idea why?
They speculated maybe melting happening more in the east, recrystallizing in the west, maybe even linked to asymmetries in the magnetic field.
But that's debated too.
Oh, yeah. Frost and Romanovich in 2017 looked again and found only weak anisotropy overall and no clear east-west difference. So the jury's still out on that one. It just shows how much fine detail we're still trying to resolve.
Okay, so we've got this incredibly complex, layered, possibly asymmetric solid ball growing down there, which brings us to its dynamics. How does it grow? How does it move? And ultimately, how old is it?
Right. The growth part is key. It's basically growing because the whole Earth is slowly cooling down.
About 100 degrees Celsius per billion years, the sources said.
Something like that. So as the liquid outer core cools at the boundary with the inner core, iron crystallizes and adds to the solid inner core. It's slowly getting bigger.
And you mentioned this growth process drives the magnetic field.
It's believed to be the main driver, yes. As the iron solidifies, it leaves behind lighter elements, like oxygen, in the liquid just above it. This lighter, buoyant fluid rises, driving convection currents in the outer core.
And those currents generate the dynamo. So the inner core's growth is literally powering our planetary shield.
In large part, yes. And its presence also helps organize and stabilize those flows.
Okay, now the spin. This has been in the news recently. Does it spin differently from the rest of the Earth?
That's been the theory for a while, since it's basically floating in the liquid outer core, not rigidly attached. Back in the 90s, seismologists thought they detected superrotation.
Meaning spinning faster than the surface.
Yeah. Early estimates were like 1 degree per year faster, which is actually quite a lot. Later studies using these clever seismic doublets.
What are those?
Recordings of earthquakes from the exact same spot, but years apart. By comparing how long waves took to travel through the inner core on those two different dates, they could infer changes, presumably due to rotation. That refined the estimate to maybe 0.33 through 0.5 degrees per year superrotation.
But then the 2023 study came out.
Right. This was a big one. It suggested that around 2009, the inner core actually stopped superrotating and might now be rotating slightly slower than the surface.
So it oscillates, speeds up, slows down.
That's the idea. Maybe on a cycle of about 7 decades. And fascinatingly, that timescale seems to match other long-term variations we see, like tiny changes in the length of the day and shifts in the magnetic field.
Like a giant slow pendulum deep inside the Earth linked to surface phenomena. That's wild.
It really is. Besides rotation, there are other subtle motions. The sun and moon's gravity tugs on the Earth, mostly the mantle.
But that can make the inner core's axis wobble slightly. Nutate.
Yeah, on about a daily cycle. And some have even wondered if, in the past, tidal forces could have gotten into resonance and temporarily stopped the inner core from growing. It's a complex dance down there.
Which leads us to the grand finale. How old is this thing? When did it start forming?
Ah, the big question. And the answer is, well, we're not sure. Estimates span a huge range from maybe only 500 million years ago to perhaps 2 billion years ago, or even older.
Why such uncertainty?
There are basically two main lines of evidence, and they don't perfectly agree yet. First is thermodynamic modeling, basically, calculating how fast the Earth must have cooled.
Based on how much heat is needed to power the magnetic field.
Exactly. You need a certain amount of heat flowing out of the core to drive convection. Early models, like Labrosse's in 2001, suggested about 1 billion years old, plus or minus 500 million.
But then things got complicated with new measurements.
Right. Around 2012-2013, new experiments suggested iron conducts heat and electricity much better at core conditions than previously thought. That meant you needed less heat flow to drive the dynamo, implying the core cooled faster, and the inner core must be younger, maybe less than 700 million years old.
Okay.
But then, in 2016, Konopkova and colleagues did direct measurements of thermal conductivity right at core conditions and found it was actually much lower.
Lower conductivity, meaning it cooled slower.
Exactly, which pushed the possible age way back up again, potentially as old as 4.2 billion years, though most estimates are younger than that. It made the older ages plausible again. It just shows how sensitive these models are to the basic physics.
What a roller coaster. Okay, what's the second line of evidence? Paleomagnetism.
Yeah, looking at the magnetic field recorded in ancient rocks, the idea is that the birth of the solid inner core should have changed how the dynamo worked, maybe making the field stronger or more stable.
So do we see a change in the rock record?
We see hints. Smirnov and others in 2011 looked at rocks from 2.5, 2.8 billion years ago and suggested the field was different back then, maybe implying the inner core formed sometime between 3.5 and 2.0 billion years ago.
Okay, that's quite old.
Then Biggin and colleagues in 2015 saw a big jump in field strength around 1.0 to 1.5 billion years ago and speculated that might be the inner core's birthday party.
Getting younger.
And then most recently, Bono and others in 2019 looked at Ediacaran rocks about 565 million years old. They found the field then was unusually weak and unstable.
Suggesting the inner core hadn't formed yet or had only just started.
Exactly, supporting a much younger age, maybe around 500 million years. And recent Cambrian data seems to back that up.
So the paleomagnetic data seems to lean towards a younger age, maybe 0.5 to 1.5 billion years, while the thermodynamics is more complicated but allows for older ages too.
That's a fair summary right now. It's very much an active debate. New data, new models are constantly shifting the picture. We just don't have the definitive answer yet on when this crucial part of our planet was born.
Wow. Okay, so we've taken quite the deep dive there, from Ingelheim cleverly spotting an echo,
To mapping its incredible heat and pressure.
understanding its complex, layered, anisotropic structure.
Its surprising rotation changes, and this ongoing mystery about its true age.
It really is fascinating how much we've learned about a place we absolutely cannot visit just by listening, essentially.
Yeah.
And yet, how much we still don't know for sure.
Absolutely. And it's worth remembering just how critical this hidden world is, that slow growth driving the magnetic field.
Our shield against solar radiation. Without it, life as we know it probably wouldn't exist.
Which leads to a final thought, perhaps. If the inner core's birth, its growth, its dynamics are so crucial for Earth's habitability.
What could studying its evolution tell us about our planet's deep past? Or even its future?
Or maybe even about the potential for life on other rocky planets out there in the cosmos. How common are stable inner cores and magnetic fields? It really puts our own planet in perspective. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We sift through the sources so you don't have to, giving you those essential nuggets of knowledge to get you instantly well informed. Now, when you hear the word yoga, what's the first thing you picture? For a lot of us, it's probably someone doing a physical pose, right? Like, maybe warrior pose or balancing on one leg. But what if that picture, that common image, is really just the surface? Like the tiny tip of this massive, ancient, and frankly, pretty surprising iceberg. What is yoga, really? That's what we're getting into today.
And that's exactly our mission here. We've gone through a whole range of sources, really focusing on the comprehensive Wikipedia deep dive into yoga to pull out the key insights for you. The idea is to, challenge some of those common assumptions and show you the multiple, sometimes even conflicting views on this thing everyone recognizes but maybe doesn't fully grasp. You're basically getting a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed about what yoga actually encompasses.
Okay, so let's start with the word itself, yoga. Its origins are actually really revealing, aren't they? It comes from this Sanskrit root yud, that's Y-U-J, and it means things like to attach, join, harness, or yoke.
Mm-hmm. And that last one, yoke, is interesting because it's directly related to the English word yoke, like for oxen.
Exactly. That connection is there.
And that root, meaning it really evolved. At first, it seems it was more about yoking in or like restraining your senses, getting control internally. But then it kind of broadened out into this powerful metaphor for linking or yoking to something higher, the divine maybe, or a greater consciousness. What's really interesting is that ancient grammarians like Patini debated this. He suggested two roots, one meaning to yoke, the other to concentrate. And traditional commentators often lean towards to concentrate, or samadhi. So right from the start, you see this strong emphasis on mental discipline, focus.
That's a key point. So if the root is about concentration, about yoking, how did yoga end up meaning so many different things? It feels like one word carrying a lot of weight.
It absolutely does carry a lot. You have scholars like David Gordon White pointing out that yoga probably has a wider range of meanings than almost any other Sanskrit word. He basically says it's hard, if not impossible, to define exactly. It was never just one single thing.
Right. So to really get our heads around this, maybe we should look at some of those classical definitions. From different times, different traditions in India, you can really hear how varied the interpretations were.
Definitely. Let's take a few. If you go back to the Maitrayani Upanishad, maybe around the 4th century BCE, it talks about the oneness of breath, mind, and senses, and then, importantly, the surrendering of all conceptions. Very internal, very mental. Then jump forward to the Bhagavad Gita, maybe 2nd century BCE. Here, yoga is described as equanimity in both success and failure, or even skill in action, a very different flavor, more about how you engage with the world. And then, of course, the big one, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, maybe 1st century CE. This gives us probably the classic Hindu definition, calming down the fluctuations or the patterns of the mind, Chittavritti Nirodha. You even see definitions focusing on union, like Kandinya in the 4th century CE, defining it as the union of the self and the Lord. Or much later, in a 14th century Hatha Yoga text, the Yoga Vibhija, it's described as the union of all sorts of dualities, breath types, sun and moon, individual self, and supreme self.
Wow. Okay, so oneness, equanimity, mental calming, union, it really covers a lot of ground. So what's the main takeaway for understanding yoga today? Given all that, it's obviously not just one practice.
Exactly. A scholar named Nut A. Jacobson tried to sort of categorized this, and he came up with 5 main meanings you see recurring. 1, it's a disciplined method to reach a goal. 2, it's the actual techniques used to control mind and body. 3, it can refer to a specific school of philosophy, like Patanjali's yoga school. 4, is the various traditions that specialize in these techniques. And 5, sometimes yoga just refers to the goal itself, the state you're trying to achieve. It really highlights just how broad and adaptable this concept has always been.
Okay, so with all these definitions floating around, you have to ask, where did it all begin? Let's try and trace the roots. This history sounds pretty complicated.
It is. And there isn't one single story everyone agrees on, which might be surprising. You basically have 2 main theories kicking around. There's the linear model, which many Hindu scholars prefer. This sees yoga developing directly out of the ancient Vedic traditions, like a straight line back. Then there's the synthesis model, which is maybe more common among Western scholars. This view suggests yoga emerged from a mix combining non-Vedic, probably indigenous practices, with elements from the Vedic religion. This model often points to the Shramana movements in northeast India. Think early Buddhists and Jains as being really crucial for developing early yogic ideas and practices.
That's interesting. And here's something that often comes up, that connection people make to the Indus Valley civilization. There's that famous seal, the Pashupati seal, with the seated figure.
Right, the figure in a seated posture. For a long time, people pointed to that as maybe the earliest evidence of yoga. But actually, more recent scholarship is pretty clear that this link is highly speculative. There's no definitive proof that figure is doing yoga or represents a prototype of Shiva as Lord of Yoga. It's more of an interpretation projected backwards.
Okay, so scratch the Indus Valley connection as solid proof. Where do we find the earliest concrete hints then?
Well, if you look between roughly 1,500 BCE, in the Vedas themselves, texts like the Rig Veda, the Atharva Veda, you find references to ascetics, people practicing austerities, maybe some forms of breath control. You can call it proto-yoga. Early Aegean traditions also show evidence of yogic practices, perhaps as early as 900 BCE. But the first really recognizable classical yoga practices start showing up in the Upanishads, which come towards the end of the Vedic period. The Katha Upanishad, maybe 5th to 3rd century BCE, is a key one. It's the first text we know of that uses the word yoga in the sense we kind of understand it today. It defines it as the steady control of the senses, which leads to a supreme state. Other Upanishads also start talking more explicitly about things like pranayama, breath control, and pratyahara, which is withdrawing the senses inward.
Got it. So the ideas were simmering for a long time, but started getting clearer in the Upanishads. Then what happens next? You mentioned the second urbanization period.
Right, roughly 500 to 200 BCE. This is when things really start to crystallize. Systematic yoga concepts emerge more fully in texts like early Buddhist scriptures, the Middle Upanishads, and the massive epic, the Mahabharata.
And the Buddhist connection is significant here.
Hugely significant. Those Shramanta circles, including early Buddhists, were really developing sophisticated mind-body techniques, things called dhyana, meditation, and tapas, austerities, aimed at achieving liberation. The Buddha himself is said to have experimented with various meditative practices before finding his own path. The early Buddhist texts, the Pali Canon, actually document probably the first really systematic and comprehensive school of yoga practice we have recorded. And it's not just happening in isolation. Around the 4th century BCE, when Alexander the Great came to India, his companions actually wrote about seeing Indian gymnosophists or yogis. They described these figures as being aloof, holding motionless postures, trying to rid the spirit of pain and pleasure. So you even get these early glimpses from Western observers.
Fascinating. And the Mahabharata, how does yoga feature there? Because that's central to Hinduism.
Yes, the Mahabharata is crucial. It describes different forms of yoga, like Nirvana Yoga, which involves a kind of progressive withdrawal of consciousness. And it clearly defines the goal of yoga as uniting the individual self, the Atman, with the universal reality, Brahman. But the most famous part, of course, is the Bhagavad Gita, which is embedded within the Mahabharata. The Gita is absolutely foundational for how many Hindus understand yoga today. It introduces these 3 major paths: Karma Yoga, the path of selfless action; Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion; and Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge or wisdom. This was a huge shift because it made yoga compatible with everyday life. It wasn't just for renunciants anymore. The focus became renouncing the attachment to the results of your actions, not action itself. In fact, every single one of the Gita's 18 chapters is named after a specific form of yoga.
Incredible. So the Gita really broadened the whole concept. Okay, moving forward in time, we get to the classical era, maybe 200 BCE to 500 CE, and this is where Patanjali comes in, right? The Yoga Sutras.
Exactly. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras are a landmark. They're generally considered the first systematic compilation of yoga philosophy. He wasn't necessarily inventing everything from scratch. He was synthesizing ideas from existing traditions. Samkhya philosophy, Buddhism, Jainism were all influences. And he gives that famous, concise definition. Yoga Shitavati Nirodha. Yoga is the stilling of the movements or fluctuations of the mind. He also lays out the famous 8 limbs of yoga, or Ashtanga. This provides a structured path.
Right, the 8 limbs. Can you quickly recap those?
Sure. It starts with ethics. The yamas, restraints like nonviolence, truthfulness, and niyamas, observances like purity, contentment. Then comes asana. Posture, though, probably meaning just a steady meditation seat back then, not the dynamic poses of today. Then pranayama, breath control, followed by pratyahara, sense withdrawal, turning attention inwards. Then the more internal stages, dharana, concentration, dhyana, meditation, and finally samadhi, a state of profound absorption or meditative consciousness. It's a progressive path. And one key difference from the closely related Samkhya philosophy is that Patanjali's system does accept the existence of a personal god, or Ishvara, which can be an aid in the practice. Samkhya is traditionally non-theistic.
Got it. So Patanjali provides this foundational framework. Were there other important developments in this classical era?
Oh, absolutely. You have other significant texts emerging, like the Yoga Yajnavalkya, which is another classical treatise, written as a dialogue between a sage and his wife. You also see continued development within Buddhist yogic traditions, particularly in the Abhidharma and later the Yogacara schools, which really delve deep into the workings of the mind. And the cross-pollination continued. You can see parallels between Patanjali's 5 yamas and the 5 main vows in Jainism, for instance.
Okay, so a very rich period. Let's move into the Middle Ages, say 500 to 1500 CE. What are the key shifts then?
Well, a couple of major things stand out. First, the Bhakti movement, the path of devotion, really flourishes across India. And yoga practices become increasingly integrated with devotional worship. Second, this is the era where Tantra becomes more prominent. Tantra introduces some really distinctive elements, many of which are quite familiar in modern yoga, even if people don't realize their tantric roots. Think about complex visualizations, the subtle body energetics involving chakras, those energy centers, and the concept of kundalini, this dormant spiritual energy coiled at the base of the spine that yoga aims to awaken. These ideas gained significant traction during this period, and this is also where Hatha Yoga, the more physically oriented practices, really starts to develop and take shape, though it looked different from today's Hatha.
Hatha Yoga emerging then. That's interesting. And other traditions. How did Sikhism, which was forming during the later part of this period, interact with yoga?
Yeah, Sikhism's founder, Guru Nanak, definitely engaged with the yogic traditions prevalent at the time, particularly Nath yogis practicing Hatha Yoga. However, Guru Nanak generally advocated for a different path, what he called Sahaja Yoga, a more natural, spontaneous, and effortless state of union achieved through meditating on the divine name, rather than through the forceful techniques and austerities sometimes associated with Hatha Yoga.
Right.
So we've traced this incredible journey through ancient and medieval India. Now, how does yoga make the leap to the West and become what most people recognize today? This is where the story takes another major turn. The mid-19th century sees the beginnings of Western intellectual interest in Indian philosophies, including yoga. Figures like Emerson and Thoreau were reading translations. But the really pivotal moment for bringing yoga practice to the West comes in the 1890s with Swami Vivekananda. He made a huge impact at the Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago in 1893. He presented yoga primarily as a philosophy and a method for spiritual growth, focusing more on Raja Yoga, the yoga of mind control based on Patanjali, and the philosophical aspects, rather than the physical postures.
So Vivekananda opened the door, but the yoga he taught wasn't quite the yoga class down the street today.
Not exactly. There was another subtle but crucial shift that happened, influenced partly by scholars like Mircea Eliade later in the 20th century. The understanding of where transcendence happens started to shift. It wasn't just purely in the mind anymore. The body itself became seen as a vehicle, a site for transformation and even transcendence. And this kind of paves the way for what we now call yoga as exercise.
Yoga as exercise. That feels like a really important distinction to make.
It's a crucial distinction. What most people in the West, and increasingly globally, experience as yoga today is largely a 20th century phenomenon. It's essentially a blend, a synthesis of traditional Hatha Yoga elements with Western physical culture, particularly gymnastics. Pioneers in India like Sri Yogendra and Swami Kuvalananda in the early 20th century started promoting yoga for health and fitness, trying to demystify it and study it scientifically. And here's a fascinating fact. Before about 1900, Hatha yoga texts describe very few standing postures. Most practice was seated, focused on breath and meditation. The famous sun salutation sequence that was actually developed in the 1920s, possibly influenced by British military exercises. Then you have figures like T. Krishnamacharya, teaching in Mysore from the 1930s to the 50s. He incorporated many dynamic standing poses, likely influenced by gymnastics and Western physical training methods common at the time. And his students became incredibly influential people like Pattabhi Joy, who developed Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga, and BKS Iyengar, who created Iyengar Yoga. They really popularized these dynamic posture-focused styles globally.
Wow. So the yoga many know today is actually quite a modern invention, blending traditions. And this changed the goal too, right?
Absolutely. For many practitioners today, the primary goal isn't necessarily spiritual liberation, moksha, in the classical sense. It's shifted much more towards physical fitness, flexibility, strength, stress relief, relaxation, and general well-being. A lot of the more esoteric or deeply philosophical components have often been downplayed or removed entirely in mainstream classes. So now, when you see a class advertised as Hatha Yoga, it often just means a relatively gentle posture-based class, rather than referring to the specific medieval tradition with its complex, subtle body theories.
And the result of this transformation.
Well, it's undeniable. Yoga has exploded into this massive, multi-billion-dollar global industry. It's gained incredible recognition. You have the UN declaring an International Day of Yoga, UNESCO listing it as intangible cultural heritage. And there's a growing body of scientific research showing real benefits for certain conditions, like low back pain, stress reduction, although sometimes the benefits are found to be similar to other forms of exercise.
Okay, so we've seen this evolution within Indian traditions and its global spread as exercise. But how has yoga been received or interpreted by other major world religions? It originated in India, but its reach is far wider now.
That's a really important to mention. Of course, within India, yoga is integral not just to Hinduism, but also to Jainism and Buddhism, though with their own distinct goals and methods. In Jainism, for example, yoga is absolutely central. It's a practice aimed squarely at liberating the soul from karma, involving strict adherence to nonviolence, ahimsa, austerities, tapas, and various meditative techniques. In Buddhism, the goal is different. It's bodhi, awakening, or nirvana, liberation from suffering. Early Buddhist yoga, as we mentioned, centered on meditations, dhyanas, and mindfulness, always underpinned by ethical conduct. Later Buddhist schools like Theravada and Mahayana traditions like Yogacara developed incredibly detailed meditation manuals and incorporated techniques like mantras and complex visualizations.
So distinct paths within its home region. But what about outside of India? How does it interact with, say, Christianity or Islam? That seems like a potentially complex relationship.
It definitely is complex and reactions vary hugely. Let's look at Christianity first, keeping it impartial. Some Christians do practice yoga, primarily its physical aspects. They often intentionally separate it from its Hindu spiritual roots, sometimes renaming poses, avoiding Sanskrit terms or chants like Om. This approach, however, has drawn criticism from some Hindu groups who view it as cultural appropriation, taking the form without respecting the context or origin. On the institutional side, the Vatican has expressed some caution. While acknowledging that prayer can potentially be enriched by techniques from other traditions, they've also warned against focusing solely on the physical, which could lead to a cult of the body or potentially cause psychic disturbance if deeper aspects are approached without proper understanding or guidance. So a nuanced stance.
Okay, a mix of integration and concern. What about Islam?
Historically, there's actually a fascinating connection. The Yoga Sutras were translated into Arabic and Persian way back in the 11th century by the scholar al-Biruni. He did, however, sometimes reframe certain concepts to align better with Islamic monotheistic theology. Generally speaking, mainstream Sunni and Shia Islam haven't really incorporated yoga practices. However, some minority Sufi movements, particularly in South Asia, did adopt certain yogic postures and breath control techniques as part of their mystical practices over the centuries. But in modern times, the question of compatibility has become more prominent and, frankly, quite contentious for some Muslims.
Right, and this has led to actual religious rulings or fatwas in some places.
Exactly. This is where it gets really interesting and quite varied. In 2008, Malaysia's top Islamic body issued a fatwa prohibiting Muslims from practicing yoga, specifically citing its origins in Hinduism, associated elements like chanting and underlying philosophies like the oneness of existence, which they felt contradicted Islamic tenets. Indonesia's Ulema Council followed with a similar fatwa in 2009, banning aspects like chanting.
Wow, a complete ban.
Well, it's nuanced. Malaysian officials later clarified the ruling. They said practicing yoga purely as physical exercise was permissible, but chanting religious mantras associated with Hinduism was forbidden. It's not a universally accepted position within the Muslim world either. Some prominent Islamic scholars, particularly in India, have criticized these bans, arguing that yoga, when stripped of specific religious rituals, can be practiced for its health benefits without compromising faith. You've also seen opposition or concern from religious conservatives or authorities in other Muslim-majority countries like Iran and Turkey at various times. So it remains a point of ongoing debate and differing interpretations regarding yoga's place and compatibility.
So wrapping this all up, what should you, our listener, take away from this deep dive? We've gone from a single Sanskrit root, yu, meaning to yoke or concentrate,
All the way to this incredibly complex tapestry. We've seen philosophical schools, diverse spiritual disciplines, centuries of evolution within India.
and then this massive global spread and transformation into a physical fitness phenomenon, alongside complex interactions with other world religions.
It's clear that yoga isn't just one thing. It's been defined, redefined, adopted, adapted, embraced, and sometimes even rejected across thousands of years and countless cultures.
Hopefully you now have a much deeper appreciation for this incredible journey. From those ancient roots aiming for liberation or union,
Through all its diverse expressions in Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism.
to the modern yoga studio down the street, often focused on health and well-being.
So the next time you encounter the word yoga, maybe in a class or a book or just conversation, we hope you'll remember this history. You'll see beyond just the poses.
To the incredibly rich, multifaceted story that has captivated people for millennia.
And maybe here's a final thought to ponder. In our fast-paced modern world, what is the ultimate goal of yoga as it's most widely practiced today? Is it still about stilling the fluctuations of the mind, as Patanjali put it, or achieving that union of dualities? Or has its most visible form fundamentally shifted its purpose? What really stands out to you now, having heard about this incredible complex journey?
Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources and unearth the most fascinating insights. Today, we're plunging into the epic saga of one of the most iconic figures from Greek mythology, Heracles. You've sent us a truly comprehensive look, and our mission today is to uncover the nuanced character, maybe surprising origins, and enduring global impact of this legendary hero, really moving beyond just his incredible strength.
Absolutely. And Heracles is, well, he's far more than just a strong man of myth, isn't he? We'll explore his complex identity as both hero and god, how his stories evolved over time, and the profound ways his cult and character resonated across ancient cultures. It's a rich tapestry of, divine intervention, human struggle, and some truly surprising details.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Heracles is often thought of simply as a super strong hero, like you said. But your sources tell us he was also considered a god. How does that work? What makes him so unique in that regard, blurring those lines?
Well, what's fascinating here is precisely that dual nature.
Yeah.
He was born Alcaeus, or Alcides, the divine son of Zeus and the mortal Alcmene,
Okay.
and only later known as Heracles, which means glory of Hera, kind of
Yeah.
ironic.
Right.
He embodies the closest Greek approach to what we might call a demigod, or hero's theos. You even see it in rituals. At the same festival, sacrifices were made to him first as a hero, with a chthonic libation that's a pouring onto the ground for underworld figures,
Okay.
and then right after as a god upon an altar. This ritual duality really highlights his unique position.
That is quite a balancing act. And speaking of his unique origin, you mentioned a truly wild birth story involving Hera's milk and the formation of the Milky Way. Can you give us the quick version of that? It sounds incredible.
It really is. So Heracles' very existence stemmed from Zeus's infidelity with alchemy, and Zeus apparently stretched one night into 3 days for this. Hera, naturally, was consumed by jealousy. She tried to prevent his birth, actually, to ensure her favored candidate, Eurystheus, became High King instead. She tricked Eilithyia, the goddess of childbirth, but Alcmene's clever servant, Galanthus, tricked Eilithyia right back, allowing Heracles to be born.
Okay, so a narrow escape right at the start.
Exactly. And then later, Athena actually brought the infant Heracles to Hera. Hera didn't recognize him, apparently, and nursed him out of pity. But he suckled so strongly that she pushed him away in pain, and her milk sprayed across the heavens, forming the Milky Way.
Amazing. So Right from the start, he's deeply intertwined with the divine, and specifically with Hera, who you'd think would absolutely hate him from moment one. Which raises an important question. If he's both hero and god, how did the ancient Greeks reconcile that? Especially with that mention in the Odyssey of Odysseus encountering him in Hades.
That's a key point, yeah. And ancient critics were aware of this problem, let's call it. In Odyssey Book 11, Odysseus encounters Heracles' ghost or shade in Hades.
Hmm.
But then the text clarifies that the man himself, Heracles, delights with the deathless gods on Olympus. This really shows the complex and probably evolving understanding of his apotheosis, his becoming a god. His cult persisted precisely because his story contained both immense suffering, the Greeks called it pathia, and that eventual ascent to heaven. It became a basis for festivals, even mysteries. And he was constantly invoked as a patron, especially for young men undergoing military training. He presided over gymnasiums, too.
Fascinating. So Hera's wrath clearly shaped his life from the get-go. We talked birth, but what about his childhood? He must have had quite a temper, right? Didn't he kill his music tutor with a lyre?
He certainly did. Not great impulse control there. After that incident, he was sent off to tend cattle, kind of rustic exile. And it was actually there, according to the Sophist Prodicus, that he faced a famous allegorical choice, the choice of Heracles. Vice offered him an easy, pleasant life, while virtue offered a glorious but severe one.
And he chose the hard path.
He chose the hard path, yeah. The glorious, severe one, setting the stage for his heroic and often tragic trajectory.
And that path led him to marriage eventually. But then, tragically, Hera's madness struck again. This prompted his most famous deeds, the 12 labors. What was the core reason behind these seemingly impossible tasks?
Well, in a fit of madness induced by Hera, of course, Heracles killed his own children. Some versions say his wife Megara, too.
Oh, terrible.
Absolutely horrific. Distraught, he fled to the Oracle of Delphi. But unbeknownst to him, the oracle was guided by Hera herself at that point. He was directed to serve King Eurystheus, the very man Hera wanted on the throne instead of him, for 10 years and perform any task required. These 12 labors were essentially set as a means for him to be purified of his terrible sin. And as the myths developed, also the path to achieving immortality and godhood.
So these weren't just random strongman stunts. They were direct consequences of divine meddling and a path to purification. Let's touch on a couple of these labors that really show his cunning, not just brute force. The cleaning of the Augean stables, for instance. That involved more than just a shovel, didn't it?
That's a perfect example of his ingenuity, yes.
Wow.
Eurystheus gave him this disgusting task. Clean the stables of Augeas, home to like 3,000 cattle whose dung was apparently magically poisonous, all in a single day.
An impossible task.
Seemingly. But Heracles accomplished it by digging ditches and diverting 2 rivers, the Alpheos and the Peneos, to just flush the whole place clean. Clever, right? But Eurystheus, being petty and likely directed by Hera, refused to accept this labor. Why? Because Heracles had arranged to get paid for it by Augeas.
Technicality.
Exactly. And he also rejected the Lernaean Hydra labor because Heracles' nephew, Iolaus, helped him by cauterizing the necks. So because 2 labors were disqualified, Eurystheus had to add 2 more, ultimately bringing the total from 10 to the famous 12.
Right, okay. So beyond these famed labors, Heracles had a long life, filled with more adventures. He was often a benefactor to mankind, but also, as we've seen, could be a pretty terrible enemy. What's fascinating here is the sheer range of his character. Witty, playful sometimes, but also cold and vengeful.
His character truly held multitudes, as you say. He definitely used his wits when strength wasn't enough. Think about how he tricked Atlas into taking the sky back after getting the golden apples.
Right.
Or wrestling Antaeus, the giant who was immortal as long as he touched the earth. Heracles figured it out and held him aloft to strangle him. So yes, he was a benefactor, making the world safe for mankind by conquering these dangerous archaic forces.
Yeah.
But his passions, his thumos, cut both ways. He performed great deeds for friends, like wrestling Death, Thanatos himself, to save Prince Amytas' wife. But he also wreaked horrible vengeance on those who crossed him, like King Augeas for stiffing him on the payment, and King Laomedon of Troy.
We'll get back to Troy.
Yeah. And Sophocles' play, the Trachiniae, even shows a real coldness in his character. He threatens his marriage to Deianira because he desires another woman, Iole, and intends to bring her into their home. This complexity isn't just, good versus bad. It's a profound reflection of how the Greeks saw heroism itself. It wasn't about perfection. It was a struggle with immense virtue, but also deep flaws, often divinely influenced.
He sounds like a force of nature, truly, in every sense. Tell us about some of his more unexpected adventures beyond the major labors. I think you mentioned something about a constellation named after him.
Yes, that's right. So, on his way back from getting the cattle of Geryon, that was his 10th labor, he got into a fight with two giants in Liguria, in modern-day Italy, France. He was finding it tough, apparently, so he prayed to his father Zeus for help. Zeus rained down stones, Heracles won, and this kneeling position as he prayed supposedly gave the name Engonason, meaning on his knees, or the kneeler, to the constellation we now know as Hercules or Heracles.
Ah, that's
And,
great.
and another famous side quest, if you will, was rescuing Prometheus. He shot the eagle that Zeus had sent to torture Prometheus by eating his liver every day.
So he's literally etched into the stars. And speaking of far-reaching impact, he even sacked Troy before the famous Trojan War of Homer. That's a detail most people miss.
It's often overshadowed, definitely. But yes, earlier on, Poseidon had sent a sea monster to attack Troy because King Laomedon had cheated him. Heracles agreed to kill the monster if Laomedon would give him these divine horses that Zeus had given Laomedon's ancestor. Laomedon agreed. Heracles killed the monster, but then Laomedon reneged on the deal. Bad move.
Seems to be a pattern with kings reneging on deals with Heracles.
It really does. So Heracles, furious, left but later returned with an army of his followers. He sacked Troy, killed Laomedon and most of his sons, except for one, Podarces, who he spared. Podarces then became King Priam, the famous king of Troy during the later Trojan War.
Wow, so he directly influenced the setup for the Trojan War.
In a way, yes. And beyond sacking cities, he also founded them, like Tarentum in southern Italy. And he helped communities by getting rid of pests. He earned epithets like Cornopian, locust destroyer, and Hippoctonus, vine wasp killer. So, a civilizing force in multiple ways.
His personal life, though, sounds just as eventful and complex as his heroic deeds, especially relationships. Your sources highlight multiple marriages, affairs, and a massive number of children.
Indeed. He married, 4 times officially in myth. Megara, who he killed in madness. Omphale, the Lydian queen. He served as a slave for a time. She famously wore his lion's skin while he wore women's clothes. Then Deianira, whose actions led to his death. And finally, after his deification, he married Hebe, the goddess of youth and Hera's daughter, on Olympus.
Marrying his tormentor's daughter.
Right. A final reconciliation, perhaps. But beyond the marriages, there are numerous affairs. One really notable episode is sometimes called his 13th labor. King Thespius wanted descendants from Heracles, so he had Heracles sleep with all 50 of his daughters. 50! The sources vary on whether it was one per night for 50 nights or all in one epic night, either way. The result was supposedly at least 50 sons. And many ancient Greek royal lines, including the kings of Sparta and Macedon, think Alexander the Great traced their lineage back to Heracles, often through these unions.
Okay, 50 daughters in one night. That certainly adds another layer to the legend, doesn't it? Even for Greek myth, that sounds like a tall tale within a tall tale. Now, the sources also mention numerous male lovers. How is that viewed in ancient Greece, and who are some of the most prominent ones linked to him?
That's right. The sources do indicate that many myths, including Heracles', were sort of homosexualized or interpreted through the lens of pederasty, after that practice developed more formally in Greece around 630 BCE. Plutarch, writing much later, claims his male lovers were countless. The one most closely linked to him was probably Iolaus, his nephew and charioteer, who helped him with the Hydra. Their bond was seen as paradigmatic. Male couples in Thebes would even go to Iolaus's tomb to swear oaths of loyalty to each other.
Interesting.
Iolaus was another prominent one, his weapons bearer, who sailed with him on the Argo as one of the Argonauts. His abduction by nymphs caused Heracles great grief. And there was Abderus, for whom Heracles supposedly founded the city of Abdera after Abderus was killed by the mares of Diomedes. This aspect really reflects the broader cultural practices and narratives of ancient Greece regarding relationships between men and youths.
Okay. So from these diverse relationships, both male and female, to his ultimate fate, Heracles' story culminates in a really dramatic death and then apotheosis. How did this larger-than-life figure finally meet his end?
His death is famously tragic, and it circles back to lust and poison, fittingly perhaps.
Yeah.
It's primarily due to the centaur Nessus. Heracles shot Nessus with an arrow poisoned by the Lernaean Hydrus blood, remember that? Because Nessus tried to abduct his wife, Deianira.
Right, the poisoned arrows.
As Nessus was dying, he tricked Deianira. He gave her his tunic, now soaked in his blood mixed with the Hydra poison, and falsely claimed it was a love charm that would ensure Heracles' faithfulness forever. Years later, Deianira became fearful that Heracles was falling for Iola, the princess he'd brought home. So she gave Heracles the poisoned tunic to wear.
Oh, no.
Yeah. The hydra's poison, activated by the heat of a sacrificial fire, burned through his skin, causing him immense, unbearable agony. Realizing he was dying horribly, Heracles chose a voluntary, noble end to his suffering. He had his own funeral pyre built on Mount Oeta and climbed onto it. As his mortal body burned away, his immortal side, his divine essence from Zeus, ascended to Olympus. There he was finally reconciled with Hera, married her daughter Hebe, and joined the ranks of the gods.
So his story doesn't actually end with death, but with ultimate triumph and acceptance into the divine pantheon, a truly unique end for a hero. What does Heracles' legacy look like globally then, beyond just Greece?
Oh, his influence spread incredibly far and wide. In Rome, of course, he was worshipped as Hercules, with his own distinct myths and temples. The Egyptians connected him to their own gods, like Shu, the god of air, and Khonsu, the moon god. Sometimes they identified him with the powerful ram god Heracles. And perhaps most surprisingly, his symbolism traveled east along the Silk Road with the Greco-Buddhist culture.
Really? How so?
His image, particularly his strength and role as a protector, is thought to have influenced the neo-guardian deities, those fierce, muscular figures you see guarding the entrances of Buddhist temples in Japan and elsewhere in East Asia.
That's amazing.
It is. And his presence is still felt today, maybe subtly. The name of Monaco, the principality, likely comes from Heracles Monoikos, meaning Heracles the lone dweller, referencing a temple there. And of course the Pillars of Hercules, the name given to the Strait of Gibraltar, marking the gateway between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. That's directly from his 10th labor, fetching Gerion's cattle from the edge of the world.
So as we've journeyed through Heracles' multifaceted story, what deeper insights can we, the learners, you, our listener, take away about heroism, suffering, and divinity in the ancient world?
Well, I think he truly embodies the human struggle, just elevated to mythic, divine proportions. His journey from that mortal birth through all the divine trials, the madness, the immense suffering, and then ultimately apotheosis, and really speaks volumes about the ancient Greek understanding of heroism, morality, and that complex intertwining of fate, divine will, and personal choice. He's a testament to endurance, certainly, but maybe also a profound reminder that even the greatest heroes are shaped, sometimes tragically, by forces far beyond their own control.
What an incredible deep dive into the many, many layers of Heracles. So for you, our listener, here's a final provocative thought to mull over. If Heracles' path to godhood was paved not just with heroic deeds, but also with profound personal suffering, madness, and even terrible mistakes, what does that suggest about the ancient Greek definition of true glory and divinity? And how might that ancient perspective perhaps challenge our modern ideas of what makes a hero truly worthy of admiration?